Hey folks, before we start today's video, I just have to tell you there was a technical error, and by a technical error I mean stupidity on my part that resulted in this video being very much out of focus. So I'm going to go away now and the video is going to begin, and I apologize for the out of focus. Maybe it's a blessing in disguise that my face will not be in focus during the course of this video. Our subject this week comes from friend of the channel, Lucas, who, as always, brings us really good stuff. He's asked for us to take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 6 and 7, and it's a tough one to look at for two reasons. Number one, it's a real hot button issue for many people. And number two, it requires us to take a look at a pretty broad passage of Scripture. And that requires a little extra time. So before we dig in, let's take a look at verses 6 and 7 from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is from the ESV. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. So the Greek here is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot for us to glean there. The issue at hand is deconstructing Paul's lengthy and somewhat convoluted argument. So what we have to do is we have to look at verses 2 through 9, and ideally we'd really be looking at verses 2 through 16. So after the video, you should go read the entirety of the first 16 verses of chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. But let's dig in, and we're going to move pretty quickly, so buckle up. Here's verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, paradoses, even as I delivered them to you. So first up, paradoses literally means things handed along. So how do you get a tradition? It's handed along from person to person, generation to generation. So the issue at hand that we're looking at today is not God's law, it's not the teachings of Christ. These are the traditions handed along from Paul to the believers in Corinth, particularly about the proper way to conduct yourselves in prayer and worship. So how do we know that it's about that? Because he referenced the traditions, and we know that there's an issue in Corinth because if there wasn't, he wouldn't be writing about this. There's no reason to write about it if there's not an issue at hand. So bear that in mind. There's a conflict in Corinth over traditional practices as given to the Corinthians by Paul. Let's move on and go to verse 3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. So again, very straightforward Greek, nothing to look at in the Greek here, but look at what Paul does. He clearly establishes a sense of hierarchy. God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of every man, and a wife's head is her husband. Not every woman's head is every man. Not males are the heads of females. A wife in particular's head is her specific husband. That's important. This is not addressing sex-based hierarchy. It's addressing a relational-based hierarchy, as the relation of God the Father to the Son Christ, Christ to mankind, but then a husband specifically to his wife. It's a relational hierarchy. Moving on to verse 4 and 5. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife, Koine, who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. That's a lot to take in, isn't it? A covered-headed man puts something between himself and his head. And if we go back to verse 3, Paul said, every man's head is Christ. So a covering on his head is putting something between himself and Christ. Now he says, every wife, not every woman, but every wife Unmarried women don't have husbands as heads. Every wife who has her uncovered head during prayer or prophecy dishonors her head. And back to verse 3, we were told her head is her in particular husband. How does this create a dishonor? If a wife does the same thing as her husband, if she uncovers her head during prayer and prophecy, she's putting herself in the same position in the hierarchy as her husband. She's skipping over him. She's cutting him out of the hierarchy and claiming that her head is the same as his, that she is under the headship directly of Christ and not of her husband. That may be terribly uncomfortable to hear in 2025, but we're not reading about 2025. We're reading about the first century AD. And so Paul says this is disordered. He's already established what the hierarchy is, and for the wife to put herself in the same position as the husband is to kick him out of the hierarchy and to put herself in the same position. Might as well have her head shaven, he says, because if she's going to act like a man, she might as well look like a man, right? There's the significance of bringing hair into this thing. If the wife is going to boot her husband out of the hierarchy and act like a man, she might as well look like a man. Which brings us to verse 6. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or to shave her head, disgraceful is iskron, let her cover her head. So if she's going to act like a man with an uncovered head, she might as well cut off her hair or shave her head so that she looks like a man. But, Paul says, because we know that that's shameful or disgraceful to falsely represent oneself as the opposite sex, then she ought to just cover her head. It's better for her to cover her head than to act disgracefully. Bear this in mind. In the Old Testament, presenting oneself as the opposite sex, whether you're a male or a female, called for a death sentence. This was considered a highly disgraceful and immoral thing. You could fraudulently lure someone into a relationship with you by presenting yourself as the sex that you are not, and it resulted in a death penalty. And again, I know that's tough to hear in 2025, but that's not when this was written. Moving on to verse 7. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. An image and glory here is eikon kai doxa. Eikon, like an icon, an image, a representation. Kai doxa, glory. Glory is splendor, radiance, or like majesty, the honor of someone. So man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory, doxa, of man. So I hope you see what he did here. He did something very important. Man is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Not the image and glory, because Genesis 1:27 tells us that both male and female are created in the image of God. So the glory, woman as the glory of man, is specifically rooted in the notion that the woman was made from the man. Eve was made from Adam and is his glory, splendor, and honor, where both of them together are the image of God. And one could argue the glory of God as well. But woman as the glory of man is specific to the creation story in Genesis 1 verse 27 in particular, 26 and 27. So notice this is not about one sex being inferior, it's about orderliness that recognizes God's creation. For the wives to act the same as their husbands is a rejection of that orderliness and makes them the same. God didn't create them to be the same, so if they act like they're the same, it's a rejection of the orderliness of creation, and it's a rejection of the sovereignty of the Creator. So Paul says in verse 3 that there's a clear order to things that ought not be broken. Why not? Because it makes a statement of a rebellion against the God that instituted that orderliness. God did things a particular way. If you decide to circumvent that, if you say, I want to be directly under the headship of Christ and not of my husband, and I'm going to demonstrate that by uncovering my head in prayer, in worship, and acting like a man, like my husband, then I'm rejecting God's order that he established at creation. So the man shouldn't cover his head in recognition of his head, who is Christ, and the wife should cover her head in recognition of her head, who is the man, her husband in particular, because in doing so, they're both acknowledging God's sovereignty. And this is important. It's just as wrong if the man covers his head as it is if the woman uncovers her head, because they each have distinct places in the order of things that they're representing. And if they choose to reject that and present themselves as the other, they're rejecting the sovereignty of the Creator. No matter how much some people in 2025 will hate to hear that, I'm not here to make you feel good. I'm here to talk about what was written in the text. Let's carry on and go to verses 8 and 9. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So here now Paul appeals to the chronological and teleological order of the creation story from Genesis 2, and he says Adam was made first and then Eve, and Eve was made from Adam and not Adam from Eve. And also, when we get to the teleology of it, Eve was made to fulfill an absence in Adam. It is not good for the man to be alone. He needs what the King James calls a help meet, or a partner that is commensurate, a mate that will balance him out and make him whole. And that's where the teleology comes in. So we're not talking about a hierarchy of superiority. Men are better than women. That's not what he's saying. He's saying there's an order to things at creation that respects the Creator and the Creator's plan and sovereignty. And if you act outside of that order, if you decide to overrule that order, you are rejecting the sovereignty of the Creator. Very, very important. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. We all need to ask ourselves, what was going on in Corinth that made Paul think he had to write this to them? What sort of a sex-based disordered behavior made him feel the need to reorient them toward the creation story? Simply, if we look at the facts that are written and the details that are written within the context of a cosmopolitan, mostly Gentile city in Corinth that is taking up Jewish traditions passed along by Paul for proper worship in this new Christian community, it seems like there were some sex-based struggles that didn't see things from the same perspective because they didn't come from the same tradition and because they didn't have the same concept of how humanity was brought into being through the creation story. So he has to reorient them and say, you're not just expressing yourself, you're not just choosing to put yourself on the same level with your husband, you are making a statement about the created order of things and therefore about the Creator, and that's not good. So here's what we can come away with for sure. Paul wanted the men and the women to understand that there were appropriate ways for them to conduct themselves that were reflective of their yieldedness, their acceptance that God was the Creator and was the sovereign over everything, and that everyone has a head above them, and that they need to conduct themselves accordingly in reaction to the created order and to the sovereignty of the head that is above them. Pretty great stuff, pretty powerful stuff. Lucas, thank you as always for bringing us to the good stuff. I hope that answered your question, and I would encourage everyone, Lucas and all, to please go back, read the entirety of 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 16. Really let that soak in. Carefully contemplate that significance without the filter of what the modern world is telling you about equality of the sexes and that everybody gets to be whatever they want. You can be a doorknob if you want. You can be a manatee. Whatever you think you are is what you are. That's not the world in which Paul lived and wrote, and that's not the world in which the Corinthians heard and received his message. Thanks again to everyone for watching, and until next time, Charis Kai Irene Humin, grace and peace to you.